Tonight, the valley does not wait anymore. Through every quiet step, through every restrained word, through every moment of stillness, something has been moving forward. Slowly, patiently, unavoidably. If you have journeyed through the first 4 parts, you may feel it now, that gentle tightening in the silence. Wilderness has given time for choices, time for reflection, time for restraint, but time does not stand still. Welcome back to the Three Rivers country. If this is your first night here, you have arrived at the moment everything has been leaning toward. You do not need to recall every path taken. You do not need to remember every shadow crossed. Just listen. Because the valley speaks most clearly when you are quiet enough to hear it. Before we continue, take one slow breath in and let it go. Allow your body to sink deeper into rest. There is nothing for you to carry, nothing for you to decide, only the rhythm of the river. Only the steady unfolding of the night. In part 5, the weight of silence finds its answer, and what has remained beneath the surface rises, not with noise, but with certainty. Let the story guide you. Let the words soften your thoughts, and if sleep finds you before the end, that is perfectly right. Now, we return to the Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Part 5. Her softly spoken words repeated themselves over and over again. I think that if you lived very long, I should love you. Now, as she had spoken those words, she knew that he was not going to die. Why then has she gone away, knowing that he was going to live? Why had she not remained to help him if she could? Either she had spoken the words in jest, or a new thought flashed into his mind. It almost drew a cry from his lips. It brought him up tense, erect, his heart pounding. Had she gone away? Was it not possible that she too was playing a game in giving the impression that she was leaving downriver on the hidden scow? Was it conceivable that she was playing that game against Kedsty? A picture, clean-cut as the stars in the sky, began to outline itself in his mental vision. It was clear now what Mui's mumblings about Kedsty had signified. Kedsty had accompanied Maret to the scow. Mui had seen him, had given the fact away in his fever. Afterward, he had clamped his mouth shut through fear of the big man of the law. But why still later had he almost been done to death? Mui was a harmless creature. He had no enemies. There was no one at the landing who'd have assaulted the old trailer, whose hair was white with age. No one, unless it was Kedsty himself. Kedsty at bay, Kedsty in a rage. Even that was inconceivable, whatever the motive of the assault might be, and no matter who had committed it. Mui had most certainly seen the inspector of police accompany Maret Radisson to the scow, and a question which Kent found it impossible to answer was, had Maret Radisson really gone down the river on that scow? It was almost with a feeling of disappointment that he told himself it was possible she had not. He wanted her on the river. He wanted her going north, and still farther north. The thought that she was mixed up in some affair that had to do with Kedsty was displeasing to him. If she was still in the landing, or near the landing, it could no longer be on account of Sandy McTrigger, the man his confession had saved. In his heart he prayed that she was many days down the Athabasca, for it was there, and only there, that he would ever see her again. And his greatest desire, next to his desire for his freedom, was to find her. He was frank with himself in making that confession. He was more than that. He knew that not a day or night would pass, that he would not think or dream of Marette Radisson. The wonder of her had grown more vivid for him with each hour that passed, and he was sorry now that he had not dared to touch her hair. She would not have been offended with him, for she had kissed him after he had killed Impas, to lay his hand on that soft glory that had crowned her head. And then the little bell in his watch tinkled the hour of 10. He sat up with a jerk. For a space he held his breath while he listened. In the hall outside his room there was no sound. An inch at a time he drew himself off his bed until he stood on his feet. His clothes hung on hooks in the wall, and he groped his way to them so quietly that one listening at the crack of his door would not have heard him. He dressed swiftly. Then he made his way to the window, looked out, and listened. In the brilliant starlight he saw nothing but the two white stubs of the lightning-shattered trees in which the owls lived, and it was very still. The air was fresh and sweet in his face. In it he caught the scent of the distant balsams and cedars. The world, wonderful in its night silence, waited for him. It was impossible for him to conceive of failure or death out there, and it seemed unreal and trivial that the law should expect to hold him, with that world reaching out its arms to him and calling him. Assured that the moment for action was at hand, he moved quickly. In another 10 seconds he was through the window, and his feet were on the ground. For a space he stood out clear in the starlight. Then he hurried to the end of the building and hid himself in the shadow. The swiftness of his movement had brought him no physical discomfort, and his blood danced with the thrill of the earth under his feet, and the thought that his wound must be even more completely healed than he had supposed. A wild exultation swept over him. He was free. He could see the river now, shimmering and talking to him in the starlight, urging him to hurry, telling him that only a little while ago another had gone north on the breast of it, and that if he hastened, it would help him to overtake her. He felt the throb of new life in his body. His eyes shone strangely in the semi-gloom. It seemed to him that only yesterday Marette had gone. She could not be far away, even now. And in these moments, with the breath of freedom stirring him, with the glory of new life, she was different for him from what she had ever been. She was a part of him. He could not think of escape without thinking of her. She became, in these precious moments, a living soul of his wilderness. He felt her presence. The thought possessed him that somewhere down the river she was thinking of him, waiting, expecting him, and in that same flash he made up his mind that he would not discard the boat as he had planned. He would conceal himself by day and float downstream by night until at last he came to Marette Radisson. And then he would tell her why he had come, and after that he looked toward Crosson's place. He would make straight for it, openly, like a man bent on a mission. There was no reason to conceal. If luck went right and Crosson was abed, he would be on the river within 15 minutes. His blood ran faster, as he took his first step out into the open starlight. 50 yards ahead of him was the building which Cardigan used for his fuel. Safely beyond that, no one could see him from the windows of the hospital. He walked swiftly. 20 paces, 30, 40, and he stopped as suddenly as the half-breed's bullet had stopped him weeks before. Round the end of Cardigan's fuel house came a figure. It was Mercer. He was twirling his little cane and travelling quietly as a cat. They were not 10 feet apart, yet Kent had not heard him. Mercer stopped. The cane dropped from his hand. Even in the starlight, Kent could see his face turn white. "Do not make a sound, Mercer," he warned. "I am taking a little exercise in the open air. If you cry out, I will kill you." He advanced slowly, speaking in a voice that could not have been heard at the windows behind him. And then thing happened that froze the blood in his veins. He had heard the scream of every beast of the great forests, but never a scream like that which came from Mercer's lips now. It was not the cry of a man. To Kent, it was the voice of a fiend, a devil. It did not call for help. It was wordless, and as the horrible sound issued from Mercer's mouth, he could see the swelling throat and bulging eyes that accompanied the effort. They made him think of a snake, a cobra. The chill went out of his blood, replaced by a flame of hottest fire. He forgot everything but that this serpent was in his path. Twice he had stood in his way, and he hated him. He hated him with a virulency that was death. Neither the call of freedom nor the threat of prison could keep him from wreaking vengeance now. Without a sound, he was at Mercer's throat, and the scream ended in a choking shriek. His fingers dug into flabby flesh, and his clenched fist beat again and again into Mercer's face. He went to the ground, crushing the human serpent under him, and he continued to strike and choke as he had never struck or choked another man, all other things overwhelmed by his mad desire to tear into pieces this two-legged English vermin who was too foul to exist on the face of the earth. And he still continued to strike, even after the path lay clear once more between him and the river. Chapter 10. What a terrible and inexcusable madness had possessed him, Kent realized the instant he rose from Mercer's prostrate body. Never had his brain flamed to that madness before. He believed at first that he had killed Mercer. It was neither pity nor regret that brought him to his senses. Mercer, a coward and a traitor, a sneak of the lowest type, had no excuse for living. It was the thought that he had lost his chance to reach the river that cleared his head as he swayed over Mercer. He heard running feet. He saw figures approaching swiftly through the starlight, and he was too weak to fight or run. The little strength he had saved up, and which he had planned to use so carefully in his flight, was gone. His wound, weak in bed, muscles unaccustomed to the terrific exertion he had made in these moments of his vengeance, left him now panting and swaying as the running footsteps came nearer. His head swam. For a space, he was sickeningly dizzy, and in the first moment of that dizziness, when every drop of blood in his body seemed rushing to his brain, his vision was twisted and his sense of direction gone. In his rage, he had overexerted himself. He knew that something had gone wrong inside him and that he was helpless. Even then, his impulse was to stagger toward the inanimate Mercer and kick him, but hands caught him. and held him. He heard an amazed voice, then another, and something hard and cold shut round his wrists, like a pair of toothless jaws. It was Constable Carter, Inspector Kedsty's right-hand man, about barracks, that he saw first, then old Sands, the caretaker at Cardigan's place. Swiftly as he had turned sick, his brain grew clear, and his blood distributed itself evenly again through his body. He held up his hands. Carter had slipped a pair of irons on him, and the starlight glinted on the shining steel. Sands was bending over Mercer, and Carter was saying in a low voice, "It is too bad, Kent, but I have but to do it. I saw you from the window just as Mercer screamed. Why did you stop for him?" Mercer was getting up with the assistance of Sands. He turned a bloated and unseeing face toward Kent and Carter. He was blubbering and moaning, as though entreating for mercy, in the fear that Kent had not finished with him. Carter pulled Kent away. "There is only one thing for me to do now," he said. "It is not pleasant, but the law says I must take you to barracks." In the sky, Kent saw the stars clearly again, and his lungs were drinking in the cool air, as in the wonderful moments before his encounter with Mercer he had lost. And it was Mercer who had made him lose. Carter felt the sudden tightening of his muscles as he walked with a hand on his arm, and Kent shut his teeth close and made no answer to what Carter had said, except that Carter heard something which he thought was a sob, choked to death in the other's throat. Carter too was a man bred of the red blood of the North, and he knew what was in Kent's heart, for only by the breadth of a hair had Kent failed in his flight. Pelly was on duty at barracks, and it was Pelly who locked him in one of the 3 cells behind the detachment office. When he was gone, Kent sat down on the edge of his prison cot, and for the first time let the agony of his despair escape in a gasping breath from between his lips. Half an hour ago, a world had reached out its arms to him, and he had gone forth to its welcome, only to have the grimmest tragedy of all his life descend upon him like the sword of Damocles. For this was real tragedy. Here there was no hope. The tentacles of the law had him in their grip, and he could no longer dream of escape. Ghastly was the thought that it was he, James Kent, who had supervised the building of these cells. Acquainted with every trick and stratagem of the prisoner plotting for his freedom, he had left no weak point in their structure. Again he clenched his hands, and in his soul he cursed Mercer as he went to the little barred window that overlooked the river from his cell. The river was near now. He could hear the murmur of it. He could see its movement, and that movement, played upon by the stars, seemed now a writhing sort of almost noiseless laughter taunting him in his folly. He went back to his cot, and in his despair buried his face in his hands. In the half hour after that, he did not raise his head. For the first time in his life, he knew that he was beaten, so utterly beaten that he no more had the desire to fight, and his soul was dark with the chaos of the things he had lost. At last he opened his eyes to the blackness of his prison room, and he beheld a marvelous thing. Across the gloom of the cell lay a shaft of golden fire. It was the light of the rising moon coming through his little steel-barred window. To Kent, it had crept into his cell. Like a living thing, he watched it, fascinated. His eyes followed it to the foot-square aperture, and there, red and glorious, as it rose over the forests, the moon itself filled the world. For a space, he saw nothing but that moon crowding the frame of his window. And as he rose to his feet and stood where his face was flooded in the light of it, he felt stirring within him the ghosts of his old hopes. One by one, they rose up and came to life. He held out his hands as if to fill them with the liquid glow. His heart beat faster in that glory of the moonrise. The taunting murmur of the river changed once more into hopeful song. His fingers closed tightly around the bars, and the fighting spirit rose in him again. As that spirit surged stronger, beating down his despair, driving the chaos out of his brain, he watched the moon as it climbed higher, changing from the red of the lower atmosphere to the yellow gold of the greater heights, marveling at the miracle of light and color that had never failed to stir him. And then he laughed. If Pelly or Carter had heard him, they would have wondered if he was mad. It was madness of a sort, the madness of restored confidence, of an unlimited faith, of an optimism that was bound to make dreams come true. Again he looked beyond the bars of his cell. The world was still there. The river was there. All the things that were worth fighting for were there, and he would fight. Just how, he did not try to tell himself now. And then he laughed again, softly, a bit grimly, for he saw the melancholy humor of the fact that he had built his own prison. He sat down again on the edge of his cot, and the whimsical thought struck him that all those he had brought to this same cell, and who had paid the first of their penance here, must be laughing at him now in the spirit way. In his mental fancy, a little army of faces trooped before him, faces dark and white, faces filled with hatred and despair, faces brave with the cheer of hope, and faces pallid with the dread of death. And these boasts of his man-hunting prowess, it was Anton Fournet's face that came out of the crowd and remained with him, for he had brought Anton to this same cell. Anton, the big Frenchman, with his black hair, his black beard, and his great, rolling laugh that even in the days when he was waiting for death had rattled the paperweights on Ketsty's desk. Anton rose up like a god before Kent now. He had killed a man, and like a brave man he had not denied it. With a heart in his great body as gentle as a girl's, Anton had taken pride. In his prison days he sang songs to glorify it. He had killed the white man from Chippewan who had stolen his neighbor's wife. Not his wife, but his neighbor's. For Anton's creed was, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And he had loved his neighbor with the great forest love of man for man. His neighbor was weak, and Anton was strong with the strength of a bull, so that when the hour came, it was Anton who had measured out vengeance. When Kent brought Anton in, the giant had laughed first at the littleness of his cell, then at the unsuspected strength of it, and after that he had laughed and sung great, roaring songs every day for the brief tenure of life that was given him. When he died, it was with the smiling glory in his face of one who had cheaply righted a great wrong. Kent would never forget Anton Fournet. He had never ceased to grieve that it had been his misfortune to bring Anton in, and always, in close moments, the thought of Anton, the stout-hearted, rallied him back to courage. Never would he be the man that Anton Fournet had been, he told himself many times. Never would his heart be as great or as big, though the law had hanged Anton by the neck until the soul was choked out of his splendid body. For it was history that Anton Fournet had never harmed man, woman, or child, until he set out to kill a human snake, crushed him, and tonight Anton Fournet came into the cell again and sat with Kent on the cot, where he had slept many nights, and the ghosts of his laughter and his song filled Kent's ears, and his great courage poured itself out in the moonlit prison room, so that at last, when Kent stretched himself on the cot to sleep, was with the knowledge that the soul of a splendid dead had given him a strength which it was impossible to have gained from the living. For Anton Fournet had died smiling, laughing, singing, and it was of Anton Fournet that he dreamed when he fell asleep. And in that dream came also the vision of a man called Dirty Fingers, and with it inspiration. Chapter 11, where a bit of the big river curved inward, like the tongue of a friendly dog lapping the shore at Athabasca Landing, there still remained Fingers Row, 9 dilapidated, weather-worn, and crazily built shacks, put there by the eccentric genius who had foreseen a boom 10 years ahead of it. And on the fifth of these 9, counting from either one end or the other, was named by its owner, Dirty Fingers himself, the good old Queen Bess. It was a shack covered with black tar paper, with 2 windows, like square eyes, fronting the river, as if always on the watch for something. Across the front of this shack, Dirty Fingers had built a porch to protect himself from the rain in springtime, from the sun in summertime, and from snow in the months of winter. For it was here that Dirty Fingers sat out all of that part of his life which was not spent in bed. Up and down 2,000 miles. No one was so wise along those rivers, no one was so satisfied with himself that he would not have given much to possess the many things that were hidden away in Dirty Fingers' brain. One would not have suspected the workings of that brain by a look at Dirty Fingers. On the porch, his good old Queen Bess, he was a great soft lump, a giant, sitting in his smooth-worn wooden armchair. He was almost formless. His head was huge, his hair uncut and scraggy, his face smooth as a baby's, fat as a cherub's, and as expressionless as an apple. His folded arms always rested on a huge stomach, whose conspicuousness was increased by an enormous watch chain made from beaten nuggets of Klondike gold, and Dirty Fingers' thumb and forefinger were always twiddling at this chain. How he had come by a name of Dirty Fingers, when his right name was Alexander Toppet Fingers, no one could definitely say, unless it was that he always bore an unkempt and unwashed appearance. Whatever the quality of a 240-odd pounds of flesh in Dirty Fingers' body, it was the quality of his brain that made people hold him in a sort of awe. For Dirty Fingers was a lawyer, a wilderness lawyer, a forest bencher, a legal strategist of the trail, of the river, of the great timberlands. Stored away in his brain was every rule of equity and common law of the great North Country. For his knowledge, he went back 200 years. He knew that a law did not die of age, that it must be legislated to death, and out of the mouldering past, he had dug up every trick and trap of his trade. He had no law books. His library was in his head, and his facts were marshalled in pile after pile of closely written, dust-covered papers in his shack. He did not go to court as other lawyers, and there were barristers in Edmonton who blessed him for that. His shack was his tabernacle of justice. There he sat, hands folded, and gave out his decisions, his advice, his sentences. He sat until other men would have gone mad, from morning until night, moving only for his meals or to get out of heat or storm. He was a fixture on the porch of the good old Queen Bess. For hours he would stare at the river, his pale eyes never seeming to blink. For hours he would remain without a move or a word. One constant companion he had, a dog, fat, emotionless, lazy, like his master. Always this dog was sleeping at his feet or dragging himself wearily at his heels when Dirty Fingers elected to make a journey to the little store where he bartered for food and necessities. It was Father Leon who came first to see Kent in his cell, the morning after Kent's unsuccessful attempt at flight. An hour later, it was Father Leon who travelled the beaten path to the door of Dirty Fingers' shack. If a visible emotion of pleasure ever entered into Dirty Fingers' face, it was when the little missioner came occasionally to see him. It was then that his tongue let itself loose, and until late at night they talked of many things, of which other men knew but little. This morning Father Leon did not come casually, but determinedly on business, and when Dirty Fingers learned what that business was, he shook his head disconsolately, folded his fat arms more tightly over his stomach, and stated the sheer impossibility of his going to see Kent. It was not his custom. People must come to him, and he did not like to walk. It was roughly a third of a mile from his shack to barracks, possibly half a mile. It was mostly upgrade. If Kent could be brought to him in his cell, Kent waited. It was not difficult for him to hear voices in Kedsty's office when the door was open, and he knew that the inspector did not come in until after the missioner had gone on his mission to Dirty Fingers. Usually he was at the barracks an hour or so earlier. Kent made no effort to figure out a reason for Kedsty's lateness, but he did observe that after his arrival there was more than the usual movement between the office door and the outside of the barracks. Once he was positive that he heard Cardigan's voice, and then he was equally sure that he heard Mercer's. He grinned at that. He must be wrong, for Mercer would be in no condition to talk for several days. He was glad that a turn in the hall hid the door of the detachment office from him, and that the 3 cells were in an alcove, safely out of sight of the curious eyes of visitors. He was also glad that he had no other prisoner for company. His situation was one in which he wanted to be alone. To the plan that was forming itself in his mind, solitude was as vital as the cooperation of Alexander Toppet Fingers. Just how far he could win at cooperation was the problem which confronted him now, and he waited anxiously for the return of Father Leon, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the outer hall. If after all that inspirational thought of last night came to nothing, if Fingers should fail him, he shrugged his shoulders. If that happened, he could see no other chance. He would have to go on and take his medicine at the hands of a jury. But if Fingers played up to the game, he looked out on the river again and again. Fingers played with him. They would beat Kedsty and the whole of Night Division, and in winning, he would prove out the greatest psychological experiment he had ever dared to make. The magnitude of the thing, when he stopped to think of it, was a little appalling, but his faith was equally large. He did not consider his philosophy at all supernatural. He had brought it down to the level of the average man and woman. He believed that every man and woman possessed a subliminal consciousness, which it was possible to rouse to tremendous heights if the right psychological key was found to fit its particular lock, and he believed he possessed the key which fitted the deeply buried and long-hidden thing in Fingers' remarkable brain. Because he believed in this metaphysics which he had not read out of Aristotle, he had faith that Fingers would prove his salvation. He felt growing in him stronger than ever, a strange kind of elation. He felt better physically than last night. The few minutes of strenuous action in which he had half killed Mercer had been a pretty good test, he told himself. It had left no bad effect, and he need no longer fear the reopening of his wound. A dozen times he had heard a far door open and close. Now he heard it again, and a few moments later it was followed by a sound which drew a low cry of satisfaction from him. Dirty Fingers, because his woeful weight and lack of exercise, had what he called an asthmatic wind, and it was this strenuous working of his lungs that announced his approach to Kent. His dog was also afflicted, and for the same reasons, so that when they travelled together, there was some rivalry between them. We are both bad put out for wind. Thank God, Dirty Fingers would say sometimes. It is a good thing, for if we had more of it, we would walk farther, and we do not like walking. The dog was with Fingers now, also Father Leon, and Pelly. Pelly unlocked the cell, then relocked it again, after Fingers and the dog entered. With a nod and a hopeful look, the missionary returned with Pelly to the detachment office. Fingers wiped his red face with a big handkerchief, gasping deeply for breath. Togs, his dog, panting as if he had just finished the race of his life. A difficult climb, wheezed Fingers. Difficult climb. He sat down, rolling out like a great bag of jelly in the one chair in the cell, and began to fan himself with his hat. Kent had already taken stock of the situation. In Fingers' florid countenance and in his almost colourless eyes, he detected a bit of excitement which Fingers was trying to hide. Kent knew what it meant. Father Leon had found it necessary to play his full hand to lure Fingers up the hill, and had given him a hint of what it was that Kent had in store for him. Already the psychological key had begun to work. Kent sat down on the edge of his cot and grinned sympathetically. "It has not always been like this, has it, Fingers?" he said then, leaning a bit forward and speaking with a sudden, low-voiced seriousness. "There was a time, 20 years ago, when you did not puff after climbing a hill. 20 years make a big difference sometimes." "Yes, sometimes," agreed Fingers in a wheezy whisper. 20 years ago you were a fighter." It seemed to Kent that a deeper color came into Dirty Fingers' pale eyes in the few seconds that followed these words. "A fighter," he repeated. "Most men were fighters in those days of the gold rushes. Were not they, Fingers? I have heard a lot of the old stories about them in my wanderings, and some of them make me thrill. They were not afraid to die, and most of them were pretty white when it came to a showdown. You were one of them, Fingers. I heard a story one winter far north. I have kept it to myself, because I have sort of had the idea that you did not want people to know, or you would have told it yourself. That is why I wanted you to come to see me, Fingers. You know the situation. It is either the noose or iron bars for me. Naturally, one would seek for assistance among those who have been his friends, but I do not, with the exception of Father Leon. Just friendship will not save me, not the sort of friendship we have today. That is why I sent for you. Do not think that I am prying into secrets that are sacred to you, Fingers. God knows I do not mean it that way, but I have got to tell you of a thing that happened a long time ago before you can understand. You have not forgotten. You will never forget. Ben Tatman." As Ken spoke the name, a name which Dirty Fingers had heard no lips but his own speak aloud in nearly a quarter of a century, a strange and potent force seemed suddenly to take possession of the forest bencher's huge and flabby body. It rippled over and through him like an electrical volticism, making his body rigid, stiffening what had seemed to be fat into muscle, tensing his hands until they knotted themselves slowly into fists. The wheeze went out of his breath, and it was the voice of another man who answered Kent. "You have heard about Ben Tatman?" "Yes, I heard it way up in the Porcupine Country. They say it happened 20 years ago, or more. This Tatman, so I was told, was a young fellow green from San Francisco, a bank clerk, I think, who came into the gold country and brought his wife with him. They were both chock full of courage, and the story was that each worshipped the ground the other walked on, and that the girl had insisted on being her husband's comrade in adventure. Of course neither guessed, and now the valley rests. What began in silence has completed its quiet path. The wilderness stands unchanged, and yet nothing is quite the same. Every step taken, every decision made, every moment of patience has settled into stillness. If you are still awake, notice how calm everything feels now. The tension that once lingered has softened. The waiting has ended. The Three Rivers country remains vast and silent, as it always has been. But you have walked through it. You have felt its quiet strength, and you have allowed its stillness to slow your own thoughts. Let that calm remain. Let your breathing stay steady. Let your mind drift freely. There is no need to analyze what has passed. No need to hold on to every detail. Just the feeling of quiet. Just the weight of peaceful stillness. And yet, the wilderness holds many stories. many valleys, many silent men. If this journey brought you calm, if it helped you empty your mind, it allowed you to sleep a little deeper, there are more stories waiting, more slow journeys, more quiet nights, more words designed not to excite, but to soothe. So, when you are ready, return. Another valley will be waiting. Another story will begin. Until then, breathe slowly. Let the night close gently around you. Sleep deeply, and I will meet you again in the next quiet place.